So, today's video, I was going to talk a little bit about, well, kind of talk about Jinx, but really kind of using her as a little bit of a segue to talk about Towers and Dragons, right? The reason I'm starting with Jinx, though, is because it took about 4 weeks, but finally we saw, of course, I have a few VODs to catch up here and there in some regions, especially the LMS. But for the most part, in the 4 major regions, we finally saw her for the first time anywhere in Korea, of all places, who actually doesn't like playing Jinx, because they find her extremely risky because of her lack of peel and stuff. But we did see her in Game 2, it was ggGetJinxed versus Longju, and I feel like that's not an accurate one to use just because Crash went off with his Nidalee. It's a great game from a juggling standpoint if you want to go and check it out. But Crash kind of destroyed everybody with his Nidalee, so it wasn't really going to be a good measuring point for Jinx specifically there. But there was a trend I noticed in that game that did happen at the time of this recording, EULCS Day 2 occurred, and Jinx was played by Vitality versus the Unicorns of Love. That also might not be a great measuring point because Yarnan is kind of like EU's Jinx main in a sense, where he's told probably back on H2K whenever he can, he wants to play that champion. So it's how you want to define those two examples. But the point of this is that right now I feel towers are kind of extremely weak. And so as such, tower shoving AD carries and tower destroying AD carries and demolitionists, in my opinion, are really good. The one thing holding them back, probably like a Tristana and Jinx, is that they're late game and the meta is not supposed to last late. But if you look across the regions, especially Korea, games are lasting very long, so that's not really a viable excuse to not play late game champions, right? I mean, for Pete's sake, Rise and Gangplank are late game champions and they're still banned or picked everywhere, and they're late game as well. So I don't really see that as a viable excuse as to not pick these late game, AD carries that then destroy these very weak towers very well. One trend I did notice with Jinx specifically though is that in both these games, Infinity Edge was not like completed first. I understand people go like BF Sword, completed boots, Zeal, but they turned the Zeal like right into the Zeal item. And in the ggGetJinxed case, it was CJ Kramer playing Jinx, and he built the Runon's Hurricane first, before Infinity Edge. And in Vitality's game, Yarnan built the, I believe, Rapid Fire Cannon before completing Infinity Edge. And in both those cases, I feel like the general mindset, I guess, amongst pros, I believe it was Deficio that was casting, or he was on the analyst desk afterward. The feeling is that Jinx is one of the weakest AD carries right now, because she's late game and scaling. And of course, so I disagree with that because I'm biased, but at the same time, if that's the reason why pros feel that way is because you're not even finishing Infinity Edge first anymore, that's kind of be a problem a little bit. Because you kind of want the AD from the Infinity Edge, and then you want some crit chance, and with Jinx specifically, you get 10 bonus AD on the rocket launcher, so you really don't have to rush the Zeal item completion. You can go Infinity Edge first. But in that particular case, you delayed the Infinity Edge so much, I feel like that was part of the problem for both these games. The difference being Yarnan did get fed. He got to be about 8-3 for the Vitality. Spoiler alert, Vitality ended up losing the game though. But what does this have to do with Towers and Dragons? Now, Dragons, I feel, after watching a lot of the Korean games and listening to like Monte Cristo and them when they're casting, Dragons don't feel like an objective that needs to be taken right now. So League of Legends has kind of turned into laning phase of Legends, and that means pretty much laning phase, and like all the lanes people are picking for lane dominance, and then maybe even ARAM in the mid lane for quite some time, which is kind of, I'm gonna say this, for me it's kind of boring to watch. I still watch for whatever reason, but it's kind of boring to watch. That's also because no one really cares about Rift Herald, because Rift Herald is kind of meh, and Dragon's not really necessary. Because you used to go for Dragon, first of all for the increased power, second of all, Dragon 2 gave you the damage to take down at the time what was stronger towers. So I feel by the towers being weak, it's also an indirect nerf to Dragons because you don't need them anymore to do what you used to have to need them to do. I don't know what that would mean going forward though, because obviously buffing towers might be an issue. You would probably need Dragons again, but games would then be dragged out even longer, I guess. And I'm not exactly sure what to do going forward. There are some changes on the PvE. Personally, I just feel like towers should kind of be buffed maybe a little bit in some capacity, and that would maybe solve some of the problem, right? You won't necessarily, that's not necessarily like the greatest idea either, and at all, that's just my opinion. I think towers being weak is a direct correlation of this entire meta. Towers are weak, so you don't need the tower shoving AD carries. So the idea that Jinx is weak, for example, surfaced based on the fact that late game doesn't exist. When late game does exist, I mean, once you get past 20 minutes, you sneeze on a tower and it goes down, no matter who you are as an AD carry. So the bias in me is saying that because it's like, okay, wait a second, that's not true. Crit AoE crit rockets are still a thing for team fights. which don't really happen. Like one team fight happens and the game's kind of over, and that kind of sucks too. I feel like I was really a fan of the death timer changes, but I just let them kind of slide because no matter what you say, things just kind of slide on through, and they'll get changed if there's like enough of a problem about it. But apparently so far death timers aren't enough of a problem, and the fact that one team fight can decide the game isn't enough of a problem, where the weaker teams can benefit as much as the better teams, because all they need is that one team fight. They can turtle and they get that one team fight that was good and then win the game. And suddenly, I mean, I guess that can still differentiate good teams from bad teams, because the good teams will know how to take that one team fight that needs to be taken, and the bad team might not. But especially with, crit chance being, random, I feel like it's a little bit of a coin toss. But that's just my opinion. I'm kind of biased on some of these things. I'm trying not to be, but I just am. I'm sorry. The towers being weak just means some of those AD carries seem weak because they need time to scale that isn't supposed to be there, or you just don't need them. Misfortune and Lucian can shove towers as good as Jinx can, really, depending. Jinx can just... Here's the thing, I feel like those tower shoving AD carries can just shove those towers that much better now, but because you don't need them to shove towers at all, why pick them when you can pick the mid-game stuff, especially Corki and stuff like that, right? But that said again, so you don't even need Dragon 2, so you really don't need to contest any of the dragons, because you can just wreck these towers without any dragon power, pretty much. And with only one team fight, necessarily maybe win the game, you don't even need the first dragon that gives you the 6 bonus like AD or AP, because you just need one good team fight. Before you might have needed that team fight because you knew you might have to fight a couple team fights to win this game. Now it's just like, whatever. Then Rift Herald, I guess, is kind of like meh as well, because it just beats you up too much and the buff isn't significant enough to break the laning phase, kind of split pushing meta that we're in right now. So I like what Rift Herald was made for. Originally it was made to stop like the 5-man bot lane dives and the max use of TP, because in pro games it kind of got to a point where it was like, okay, now why do we have a TP Jace AD carry? Solo games and stuff, you would have sometimes 5 team teleports, and that's just kind of ridiculous to play against. It doesn't matter how good you are in a champion, if you're getting dove by 5 champions suddenly TPing into your face, you're dead, and that's kind of not fun, I guess. But it was a good strategy for just like the top lane or something, but the fact that it grew so big like that is why they made Rift Herald, to hopefully keep people on that side of the map, which they did. There's a split pushing thing kind of going on, but right now, the meta's just in a really weird spot. And those 3 things, I think, kind of play a part in it. Jinx really kind of representing not just herself, but just a certain group of AD carries that you used to need to shove towers that you just don't need anymore. Tristana you do see because she has a lot of self-heal though, but you haven't seen Kog'Maw, you haven't seen Twitch, you haven't seen Draven, for example, in like any region right now, because I feel like Draven's in a different boat, but those 2 are late game carries, but the late game doesn't happen anymore, except for apparently Rise and Gangplank. But again, I'm biased, so just ignore that. Just in general, that's just my thoughts on those 3 topics. I think towers might be the key to actually solving the dragon issue without needing to really change dragons. But I think that might be too problematic and drag us back towards the really long power games, because the towers are too tough to take down now. While looking at dragons specifically, something has to change about dragon. I know this changes in the PvE, I'd have to look. But something about dragon is going to have to change before, I guess, this meta changes. So I guess that's where we're heading forward. That's what going forward is going to happen. Like I said, there's a change in the PvE. I don't know it specifically, is why I'm not saying it, but something's happening to dragon that might change things a little bit, make that more of an objective to fight for, or at least try and prioritize, and change this kind of super long lane phase, ARAM mid, one good team fight, and the game's over. Some teams have tried to make it a bit exciting, and those are really just called clown fiestas, because they're not that way, right? And instead of close game, it's called a clown fiesta. And I have my own beef with that word. That's a video for another time. But this video is concluded. I don't know what the next video is going to be, because life is full of a lot of kinks. But until next time, take care, GG, get jinxed.